9, Big 550 KTRS. I am going to tell you to bear with me for this next guest because there is going to be a payoff. This is a great story. Andrea Mays is an interesting author. She has, among her background, she grew up in New York. She spent a lifetime falling in love with Shakespeare. She is a former student of Frank McCourt, and she has written a brand new book called The Millionaire and the Baird. Henry Folger's Obsessive Hunt for Shakespeare's First Folio. Andrea Mays, welcome Big 550 KTRS.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
You got it. All right. First, lots of questions before we get started here. Who is Henry Folger?
Henry Folger was the president and later chairman of the board of the Standard Oil Company. He started with very little, came from a lower middle class family in Brooklyn, went to Amherst College, graduated, started working as a clerk for an oil company, and that oil company had the great good fortune of being taken over by Standard Oil, headed by John D. Rockefeller, and Henry Folger worked his way up in the hierarchy of the company over the years under the tutelage of John D. Rockefeller.
Okay, so Henry Folger became a very, very rich man.
He did become a very, very rich man.
Okay.
Compared with his contemporaries that he was competing for in the collecting world, though, he did not have that big a checkbook.
All right. He is the millionaire in The Millionaire and the Baird.
That's correct. And the Bard is Shakespeare.
Bard. Okay, and the Bard is Shakespeare. Okay. Why is Shakespeare called the Bard?
I have no answer for that. It's just sort of a common nickname that some people give to him.
Okay.
The Bard of Avon is kind of the nickname that he has.
All right. Okay. Now, Henry Folger's Obsessive Hunt for Shakespeare's First Folio. I'm not an expert on Shakespeare, but I've never heard of a play called First Folio.
Okay. Well, today we almost worship Shakespeare as the secular god of the English language literature. And in fact, this Saturday marks the 400th anniversary of his death in 1616. But it was not always the case that he was destined for greatness and fame. So when he died, only half of his plays had been printed, and therefore about half of them were at risk of being lost to history. So 7 years after he died, two of his actor friends, who were also shareholders in the theater that he worked in, decided to collect all of his plays and publish them in one enormous, impressive volume. And that volume is called the First Folio. And that's the first time that 36 of Shakespeare's plays, all the ones they could collect at the time, were printed together. And arguably that saved half of the plays from the ash heap of history. So that would have included The Tempest and Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, Cymbeline, Twelfth Night, Winter's Tale. An amazing list of plays which would have been lost had they not printed this First Folio.
Okay, so Henry Folger's Obsessive Hunt for Shakespeare's First Folio, he didn't just want one of them, he wanted all of them?
He wanted as many as he could get his hands on. So a typical Gilded Age collector like J.P. Morgan or Henry Huntington would want essentially a high spot. This was kind of a fetish object, still is a fetish object book, and they would have wanted a big, pristine, complete copy with a great cover. Jewels would be great, gold would be great. But Henry Folger wasn't picky. He bought some fantastic, excellent copies as well, but he also took copies that were incomplete, missing pages, missing the portrait, missing the covers, damaged, and he collected one after the other. Over 30 years, he collected every copy he could get his hands on.
Andrea Mays is our guest. The book is called The Millionaire and the Bard, Henry Folger's Obsessive Hunt for Shakespeare's First Folio. It's safe to say that Henry Folger was a Shakespeare fan?
He was. He not only acquired the books as objects, but he actually read the plays. So starting in high school, working his way through Amherst, and then in his working life, he always walked around with a copy of a play with him so that if he had a little bit of time, he could read the plays in between. His wife was also a Shakespearean in her own right. She wrote her master's thesis on the true text of Shakespeare, Emily Folger. And both of them really enjoyed seeing the plays, reading the plays, and then when he got a little bit older, he was able to contact, or other people got in contact with him, and he would correspond with Shakespeare scholars about some of the finer points of the play. So he really did read them.
And was it because he was bored out of his mind? They hadn't invented baseball cards yet. Why was he collecting these?
Oh, that's a great question. No, I think it starts as an obsession, as many obsessions do. So I certainly know obsessed collectors, not for baseball cards, but same principle, that you have to have the next one and the next one and the next one, and then the collection is bigger than you thought. And his purpose was to be able to get a lot of copies in the same place and then compare them. And it's actually very interesting to do that. Ultimately what his collection allowed scholars to do is, by having so many copies in one place, you can compare them. And you would think all of the copies were identical, but they're not. They're actually all slightly different, and you could figure that out only by having a whole bunch of them in one place.
So he bought them, I'm assuming.
Yes. Oh, yes. He bought them at auction or from dealers. At one point, a scholar in England published a census of the known copies, writing around the world to people and asking them, do you have a copy, and how much should you pay for it, and how big is it, and what is it missing, and what does it have? And Henry Folger had a copy of this census, and he wrote to, or had his book dealer write to, many of the owners of copies to ask them if they might consider selling them. So he didn't just passively wait for them to come up at auction. He went out looking for them.
And how many were originally published? It isn't like today where a printing press, or a couple of years ago where there were printing presses and used to print books. These were like hand printed, or how many?
No, they were printed on a press, but without the power of steam. So these were men who were hand turning a press, page by page, and to print a 900-page book, it took about 2 years. So we think about 750 copies were originally printed. Of those, we know of 235 that are still around. And of those 235, the Folger collection contains 82, which is an enormous number. The next largest collection is 13, which is at Meisei University in Japan, and then the collections trail off. The Henry Huntington Library has 4, and the Library of Congress has 2, but it's very unusual you'd have 82 in one place.
All right. The book is called The Millionaire and the Bard, Henry Folger's Obsessive Hunt for Shakespeare's First Folio. Andrea Mays is our guest. Let's talk brass tacks here. What's the most he paid for one of the 80 some odd that he purchased, and what are the 82 worth now?
Oh, well, the former I can answer, $100,000 in current dollars. He paid as little as 300 pounds, which would have been about $1,500 at the time. That was the cheapest copy. Today, impossible to estimate. And I doubt the Folger Library would like anybody to estimate either, but just for purposes of comparisons, an absolutely spectacular copy sold a few years ago for $6.1 million. Now, there's another copy that's going up for sale, and the estimate is only $1.7 million. So,
But we're assuming that isn't as pristine, and it's got some ruffled pages.
Mostly what happens is the portrait, which is the title page that everybody's familiar with, that engraving of William Shakespeare, that is the portrait that appears on the title page. And many times that is missing. People would cut them out of their copies and frame them and hang them up, or cut them out and sell them separately. So, that could be an issue, or could be missing a play, or could be very damaged, sometimes water damaged by insects, and missing a cover, or, things like that.
Yeah, the
so
books are well over
that would certainly affect what the quality was. But the Folger collection has a half a dozen copies that are absolutely superb condition, and impossible to know what they would fetch at auction, but they're not going up for auction anytime soon.
Andrea Mays, our guest, The Millionaire and the Bard, Henry Folger's Obsessive Hunt for Shakespeare's First Folio. This book is getting rave reviews. Now, I thought Shakespeare didn't write all the plays Shakespeare wrote.
What have you heard?
Well, those are the rumors out there. I saw it on Facebook.
Well, there are two things. One is all of the plays were partly plagiarized, partly put together as an effort among playwrights, so they would have cooperated on writing plays. Shakespeare famously cooperated with John Fletcher at the end of his career, writing plays together with him. But I think you're referring to the idea that Shakespeare wasn't really Shakespeare.
Right.
At the time that he lived, and for 150 years after his death, no one questioned that he had written the plays. We have contemporary accounts from a theater impresario who writes about that. We have dedicatory verses to the first folio written by contemporary playwrights and friends of his. No one doubted that he had written the plays. And two things happened. One is a vicar went to Stratford-upon-Avon and looked for evidence of Shakespeare. Where the plaques, where's the carving in the desk at the middle school saying William Shakespeare was here, but now he's gone. And he couldn't find anything, and he thought this was extremely suspicious. Later, an American named Delia Bacon hypothesized that it was actually Francis Bacon who had written the plays, and she was an interesting character in her own right. A book has come out about her as well. She went to England on the dime of an American businessman to find out whether Bacon had written the plays. She didn't actually go into any archives. She just went to places that Bacon had been and absorbed the atmosphere. I'm not kidding. Came back and wrote the book essentially saying, no, it was Francis Bacon who had written the book. She unfortunately had an ignominious end. She lived the end of her life in a mental institution. That alone does not mean that she was wrong, but
Right.
there's plenty of contemporary evidence to support the idea that Shakespeare wrote the plays. And sort of, I don't go down that rabbit hole too far in The Millionaire and the Bard. I do sort of present the strongest evidence that Shakespeare, A, existed, B, wrote plays, and C, wrote those plays. But ultimately, we have the plays, and whether they were written by William Shakespeare or some other guy named William Shakespeare, it doesn't really matter.
The Millionaire and the Bard, Henry Folger's obsessive hunt for Shakespeare's first folio. Andrea Mays, our guest. How did you come across this quirky particular story?
Great question. Well, as you mentioned in the introduction, I have been a Shakespearean since middle school. I'm obsessed. I had a teacher, Myra Donowitz, who is still with us, and then Frank McCourt later on, and his mentor at my high school who got me interested in Shakespeare. And then we used in high school the Folger editions of the plays. And later on, when I was studying antitrust law at UCLA Law School, Henry Folger was one of the named defendants in the great 1911 Standard Oil antitrust suit, and I thought, I wonder if this is the same guy. And it sort of passed through my mind, maybe this is the same guy. Maybe he's related. Maybe that's the coffee guy. I don't know. And then later, I moved to Washington, D.C., and I walked by the Folger Library every day on my way to work. And so finally, I put it together. I went on a tour at the Folger Shakespeare Library and asked what was the source of all the wealth. And the docent said that Mr. Folger had worked for an oil company. Well, I thought this deserved a little more research, and when I poked around, he was not just working for an oil company. He started out as a clerk at a small oil company, but then he ended up as the president of the largest corporation in the world. So I thought that was a story that would be interesting to tell, and that how his training as a businessman helped him in his obsessive hunt for these first folios and negotiating for them and sort of using his American business tactics in a world of collecting.
That's a great story and a great story. The Millionaire and the Bard, a must-read, even if you're not a Shakespeare fan, but just a fan of sort of American stories. Movies, studios have to be knocking on your door for this.
Oh, I'd be delighted if they did. I haven't heard from anyone yet. They can find me on Twitter.
All right, there you go. Andrea Mays, the book is The Millionaire and the Bard, Henry Folger's obsessive hunt for Shakespeare's first folio. Andrea, good luck with the book. Thanks for stopping by.
Thank you so much for having me.
You got it.